So I'm Shashank Matu with India Today Global. I'm joined by Einat Wilf, who is a former Israeli member of parliament, member of the Knesset, who has joined us here at the India Today conclave and has given a speech talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel's position on what is happening. She's also an author who has written very extensively on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So could I ask you to begin by giving us a sense of where the conflict is right now? There is a sense that there is, of course, a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It's fragile, but it seems to be holding on at this point in time. Are you personally optimistic about the fact that this is a ceasefire that will last over a period of a couple of months, perhaps years?
It's tough to know about this specific ceasefire, but in general, one could say that the tragedy of the conflict is a tragedy of ceasefires, where essentially every time that the Arabs and especially the Palestinians launch an attack, when they fail to achieve their ultimate goal, which has only ever been the destruction of the Jewish state, they basically cry out for a ceasefire so that they can regroup and try again. This has been the story for the last century. So I think right now what we're trying to get to is something very different. We're trying to get to a point where it's not once again a ceasefire, but where there is final recognition by the Palestinians broadly and their Arab supporters that they have been defeated in their goal of trying to destroy the Jewish state, and that therefore they need to understand that there are consequences for launching the attack, and that they can only begin to rebuild a different future if they change the ideology in the name of which they carried the attack. I will tell you that my greatest fear is that nothing will change and we will be stuck in this loop of ceasefires that have only ever been used by our enemies to try again.
So you talked about, the destruction of the Jewish state, that this, of course, might be the view of several of Palestine's Arab supporters. But, of course, Egypt has diplomatic relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords was seen as a big breakthrough where Israel established diplomatic relations with a number of other Arab countries. And before the war broke out, of course, there was a sense that even with Saudi Arabia, that was supposed to be the prize of diplomatic normalization. Is it really fair to say, though, that the Arab nations, therefore, these major powers in the Middle East that seem to be ready to make peace with Israel, that their goal is still the destruction of the Jewish state? Do you still believe that these countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, do you think that their belief is still that they wish to do away with the state of Israel?
So there are very important changes taking place in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf. I sometimes call the Abraham Accords collateral benefit. We're not the central story here. I think the leaders in some of the Gulf states are trying to rethink, reimagine what it means to be Arab and Muslim in a way that is forward-looking, modern, tolerant. I don't think it's a coincidence that the more successful countries in the Arab world are letting go slowly of this historic obsession with the destruction of the Jewish state. Egypt is a somewhat unfortunately different story. It remains one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the Arab world. It is the number one producer and disseminator of very harsh anti-Semitic content in the Arabic language, in movies, in books. So it has an official peace with Israel, but it is frozen cold. Clearly, the peace that we want to have in the Middle East is the one of the Abraham Accords, where there is a real, true Arab and Muslim embrace of the Jewish right to self-determination in the land. It's the Abrahamic vision that looks at the Jews not as white European settler colonialist crusaders, which are just the words that Arabs have given to the Jews in order to say, you don't belong here, get out, and we're going to throw you out. What the Abraham Accord countries are doing, they're changing the perspective to say Abraham, to say the Jews are an ancient people, an ancient civilization with a modern country, but in an ancient land. And as Arabs and Muslims, we embrace that, we recognize that. And the vision for peace in the Middle East depends on this version of Arab and Islamic ideas winning over the more traditional Arab and Islamic ideas that are obsessed with the destruction of the Jewish state.
Could I ask you a question, though? Because, since the conflict has begun, this has been a much talked about development in the Arab world, which is that at one point in time, the view was that just a couple of years ago, there was very little sympathy for the Palestinian problem in a number of Arab states, especially among younger populations. And that since the conflict has begun, really, you've seen groups like even Yemen's Houthis come up and sort of paint themselves as liberators in many parts of the Arab and perhaps the Islamic world as well. is Israel worried about this development? Because there is a sense that countries like Saudi Arabia, while they understand that it is in their rational interest to make peace with Israel, will feel like, look, our populations, the street, there cannot be this kind of divide between the palace and the street. The street will feel some solidarity with the Palestinian people, and because of Israel's unpopularity, if we make peace with them, it's going to become much more difficult for us to keep power. So what do you make? What sense do you make of that? That actually the war between Israel and Hamas over the last 18 months has actually made it harder for a lot of Arab countries and for populations to accept the reality that, look, we will need to coexist with Israel and make a good relationship out of it.
So it's a combination of several things. First of all, a lot of the Arab world is fed by Al Jazeera, by Qatar. As a colleague of mine says, the anti-Semitism of Al Jazeera is not a bug, it's a feature. It's the reason that Al Jazeera is listened to in many other places, unlike, I don't know, Russia Today or China, because people want that element of it. So the Arab world is exposed to that constantly. You're also seeing elements of the investments over decades of the Arab world in this ideology of destruction that have come to call Palestinianism, and you're absolutely right. Various Arab leaders, I think, now understand that they cannot afford to ignore Palestinianism as an ideology if they want their project of modern, moderate Islam and Arab identity to succeed. This ideology, which was created by failed countries, has to go. It's the ideology of failure. You mentioned the Houthis in Yemen, not exactly your forward-looking, successful country. In general, anti-Zionism, obsession with destroying the collective Jews, what Jews have built, is always the mark of failed societies. And I think, again, it's no coincidence that societies in the Arab world that want to be successful understand that they need to let go of this ideology, but the still mostly failed societies of the Arab world are holding on to that because that's pretty much the only thing they have.
So could I ask you a little bit about Israeli politics? You've, of course, been a member of parliament, and you were, of course, part of the Labour Party. This was widely considered at many points to be the party of peace that, of course, extended the hand of friendship to the Palestinians several times in the past. We've seen recently that the Israeli Knesset has voted against the creation of the two-state solution, and that has, of course, created some furore here in India because, of course, India historically has supported the two-state solution. So to an Indian audience that has generally is looking at this development in Israel, could you explain that shift in Israeli politics over the last couple of years? You're, of course, a Labour Party politician, and you, of course, have come here and have made the statements that you have about the Palestinian people and whether they're really willing to go for peace. Could you explain that shift in Israeli politics that you've seen over the last 20 years?
The shift is very much also my own personal one. Like you mentioned, Israelis once believed that the only thing separating us from peace is a Palestinian state. Let them have a state in the West Bank and Gaza, let them control territory, we will have peace. And then comes the part that a lot of people like to either ignore or actively erase. This idea was tested repeatedly by several Israeli prime ministers who directly negotiated the establishment of a Palestinian state. It was tested by unilateral disengagement, the way that was conducted in Gaza. So Israeli prime ministers, not some small side group, Israeli prime ministers tried to see if what separates us and peace is a Palestinian state, only to see it collapse completely. Now, if you're a good scientist, you ask yourself, okay, the data doesn't fit what I thought. I thought the problem was that Palestinians don't have a state. I went through this process. I began to research, and I did something very simple. I listened to Palestinians. And turns out they were very clear. They've always told us they don't want a state if it lives next to a Jewish state. They want from the river to the sea. They want no Jewish state. Actually, if you look at the last 100 years, Israel always agreed to a two-state solution, provided that one of the two is the Jewish state, and the Palestinians have always rejected the two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. The vote in the Knesset was about this moment, immediately after October 7th. What you can see for the last century, the Jews are always willing to compromise. The reason, of course, is that we're a tiny minority in an overwhelming Arab and Islamic Middle East. So we are willing to compromise for peace. The Palestinians, as long as they feel that they are supported by the Arab world, by the Muslim world, by some countries in the West, if they feel that they are supported in a century of saying no, 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 and no, then they will continue to say no.
Let me ask you a question about the military campaign against Hamas that has taken place since October 2023. You've, of course, been an intelligence officer yourself.
Yes.
Could I tap into that experience and ask you, we, of course, saw the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, before he left office, basically came out and said that Hamas has managed to recruit a large number of fighters again and has reconstituted much of its strength. There is a sense, of course, that Israel has now, after 18 months, are there more military gains that Israel could possibly make? There's a sense perhaps that has been raised by some counterterrorism experts saying that, of course, if you continue to use, let's say, an armed response, is it possible that another generation of anger will be brought up against Israel, another group of young Palestinians who will continue to pick up arms against Israel, who will, of course, be recruited by Hamas and used in this fashion against Israel? So is military force moving forward still the policy for Israel? Will it continue to generate results? What do you think?
I'll explain why military force works only under one condition. What you said is something that a lot of people said after October 7th. What Israel is doing in Gaza will further radicalize the Palestinians. Like you said, raise another generation. And I remember listening to this and thinking, how much more can they be radicalized? The mistake that people make is something that I've come to call trauma determinism. The notion that if you suffered trauma, then you necessarily will be someone who kills. We know that's not the case empirically. The Nazis suffered destruction, the Imperial Japanese suffered destruction, and today they are pillars of peace. And the reason is that it's not enough to use military force. What needs to happen is to create the connection between action and consequence. I think the biggest mistake was to declare that the enemy is Hamas. It's like the U.S. declaring in December 1941 that the enemy is Japanese pilots. Hamas carried out the October 7th invasion and massacre on behalf of the Palestinian ideology of no Jewish state. They're not some foreign group. This is why they can easily recruit, even if Israel did nothing, because the Palestinians are organized around the ideology of the destruction of the Jewish state. So now it's called Hamas. In the 70s, it was called Black September. It doesn't matter what they're called. They're Islamists, they're secular. They're all organized against the idea. So the only way we get out of it is with military force, but only by making it clear that the destruction is the outcome of the ideology, and that nothing will be built, like in Germany, like in Japan, without the change of the ideology. It should have been made clear that the enemy is not just Hamas. Hamas is just the executive arm. The enemy is Palestinianism, is this ideology that is singularly obsessed with the destruction of the Jewish state, and that ideology has to die, and nothing can be built in Gaza until the ideology is transformed.
Right. Could I ask you a little question about that? Of course, you have spent decades in Israeli politics. There was, of course, a lot of Indians will remember perhaps the visuals of 1992, the Oslo Accords between Israel and Palestine, and will then look to you and say, look, is it really possible to say that Palestinians have not wanted peace, or that they have not reconciled themselves to the acceptance of a Jewish state? Because Oslo was fairly comprehensive in terms of what it said a pathway to peace would be. So is it fair to say, therefore, that the Palestinians do not want peace?
It's incredibly fair to say, because it's very accurate, and they will say themselves if you ask them the correct questions. The mistake in Oslo was that it was a temporary agreement that actually did not demand of the sides to address any of the core issues. This is why the Palestinians could sign it. So, for example, when the Palestinians in the 90s said 2 states, and they said 2 states, some still say, we made the crazy assumption that one of the 2 states is the Jewish state. In retrospect, we had to check, because when Palestinians said 2 states, they meant an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab state that will replace Israel through this idea they have of refugee return. No one's a refugee, it's not returned, but they believe in it. There was never in the last century, not even in the 90s, a moment when the Palestinian vision of peace included a Jewish state of any size in any borders. And you only need to ask them Do you recognize that? Do you want to live next to a Jewish state? Do you understand that it means you're not refugees and there's no return? I always say that in a 20-year career, I found only 4 such Palestinians. So no, there was never a moment when Palestinians agreed to a 2-state solution when one of them is the Jewish state. This is why Arafat in 2000 and Abu Mazen in 2008, when they actually had to sign a clear agreement, not the Oslo, which was interim and fuzzy, a clear agreement that said this is over. You can have your state, but it will be next to the Jewish state, and you're not refugees, and there will be no entering Israel in the name of return. They walked away because they knew that they didn't have the people to sign an agreement that lets the Jewish state live.
Let me ask you 2 final questions. There has been, of course, since Israel's military campaign, and it has, of course, decimated Hezbollah in Lebanon. That has allowed the creation of a caretaker government that has, in some senses, moved against what Hezbollah has wanted. You've also seen the decimation of Hamas. There is a sense that Iran and its network of proxies in the region have also been decimated. Lots of people are going to look at this and say that there is a historic opportunity for Israel, for the United States, to do something here and get peace done. Do you agree with that assessment? What exactly do you think needs to happen?
I completely agree that this is a historic opportunity, which is why I fear so much that we might drop it, that we will go back to this loop of ceasefires, a ceasefire in Lebanon, a ceasefire with Gaza. This is an opportunity that needs to transform the terms of the conflict. Lebanon needs to sign a peace agreement with Israel. We have no territorial dispute with Lebanon. We can't allow Hezbollah to rearm. They're trying to do so as we speak. This has to end with a full peace agreement, not another useless UN resolution, not another ceasefire. Iran, ultimately, we don't have, people say the conflict with Iran. We don't have a conflict over some 3 islands in the Red Sea. Iran says death to Israel. We don't want to die. That's the conflict, which means that Iran, too, the ideology needs to change, either the regime or the regime's ideology, but death to Israel is not something we can live with. And the same with the Palestinians. This has to be a moment where they finally begin the long process of transformation from a people organized around the idea of no Jewish state. I agree with you. It's a remarkable moment. I fear that we might drop the ball and just go back to the loop of endless ceasefires, which has always been the tragedy of this conflict.
Let me again tap into your experience as a politician and someone who served in intelligence. There are, at this point in time, it seems 2 different ceasefire plans or plans for the redevelopment of Gaza. This is, of course, what Donald Trump said about moving Palestinians out of Gaza, rebuilding the place with the United States, of course, taking a leadership role on that. Gaza, of course, we've also seen the Arab states, notably at the recent summit in Egypt, with a lot of Arab states coming together and saying that, no, we will fund redevelopment. The Palestinians will go nowhere. We will, clear the rubble. We will rebuild, and we will make sure that Gaza is put back on track. And, of course, Hamas will be removed, and a technocratic set of advisors will be put in. Could you give us a sense of what you think is the more likely opportunity? Which one do you think Israel will be more inclined towards?
Let's start with this. The Arab proposal is a non-plan. The Arab proposal goes back to the same Arab tendency of the last century, which says, oh, we attacked the Jewish state, we failed to bring it to an end, so we demand to go back to the exact same position that we were when we launched the attack. They're saying that Gaza's territorial integrity needs to remain. In every other conflict, if you launch such an invasion and you fail, countries pay in their territorial integrity, displacement, they need to pay reparations to the country that they attacked. You're hearing none of that. What are the Arabs saying? The same territory, the same people. This technocratic government is a scam. Once you understand that, again, it's a Palestinianist ideology. It doesn't matter if you call it Hamas, technocrats. It's the same people with the same ideology. So the Arab non-plan says nothing about this ideology. Even something basic. You want the people of Gaza to remain in place? You're saying that Gaza is their home and that's why they shouldn't be displaced? Well, that's news, because for the last 75 years, the people of Gaza claimed that Gaza is not their home, because into the 5th generation, they are somehow refugees of Palestine, even though they were born in Gaza. So if you're saying that Gaza is their home, That's great. Can we move forward by making sure that no one in Gaza is registered as a refugee by UNRWA, that they recognize that there's no return? Can we begin to change the ideology? The Arab non-plan does none of that. It does what the Arabs are used to doing, demanding that they get a redo and asking everyone to pay the bills. You're saying the Arabs will pay the bills? The two countries that the Arabs want to pay the bills, Saudi and the UAE, didn't send their top-level people to that conference. In terms of the American plan, I don't know where it will go, but what it's already doing, which is incredibly valuable, is that it's bringing back the notion of consequences, that there are consequences to launching an attack, that Gaza cannot be rebuilt with the people who only ever built tunnels to attack Israel and have turned all of Gaza into a single weaponized landscape, that we need to escape from this loop that we've been stuck in of reconstruction and war, where the billions flow in merely to re-weaponize the strip. So he's bringing back those ideas. How exactly this will ultimately settle, I don't know, but it's already a much better direction than the Arab non-plan of saying we want to suffer no consequences for what we did.
Right. Do you think that increasingly a one-state solution is getting more traction in Israel particularly? There has been a suggestion, particularly from those on the more conservative side of the Israeli political spectrum, that we could absorb the territories and the lands. The settler movement has been powerful. We've already seen particular members of Netanyahu's cabinet come out and say that, look, these are lands that the Jewish people have a historic and religious claim to. We can take this over and provide a better quality of life and so on and so forth. Do you think that that idea of a one-state solution has gained more political acceptance in Israel? Do you think that is something that Israeli politicians, perhaps someone like yourself, would support moving towards?
Depends what you mean by it. To create a situation where the Jews are a minority in an Arab state has basically zero support in Israel. To annex some territories in a way that allows Israel to remain a sovereign Jewish state, that will and might have support, especially if the United States recognizes it and it's done with its support. But no matter what are the specific arrangements, if we do not address the core issue of the conflict, the broad Arab and especially the Palestinian denial of the Jewish right to self-determination in any part of the land, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter even if the people of Gaza will leave Gaza. If they are going to leave Gaza and move 10 kilometers, but with the same ideology that their top duty is to destroy the Jewish state, they will continue to devote their lives to it. So no matter what you do in practice, you can't run away from addressing the ideology and the need for the ideology to be transformed.
Right. My last question to you is that what do you see the future of Israeli diplomacy as? Israel is no stranger to controversy. It has, of course, been at the center of a major international controversy since it was created. Could you tell me a little bit about how you're seeing international politics around Israel play out? We saw Israel-Palestine become a significant question in the United States in the 2024 election. There was a suggestion that because of how controversial it had become among younger voters in America, there was declining support for that alliance relationship with the United States. I've been to Germany myself, and that they have had a big soul searching about this. A number of European countries, Ireland in particular, Spain in particular, have also recognized the Palestinian state, perhaps because of some filial solidarity towards the Palestinian people. Could you tell us a little bit about the international situation for Israel going forward? You also had that case with South Africa, of course, the International Court of Justice, ICC. Israel, of course, is no stranger to controversy, but this seems, of course, to be as large a controversy as some of the others that Israel has faced in the past. How does Israel think about its diplomatic position, its future? How does it move forward in terms of rebuilding some of those diplomatic relationships, pitching its ideas to the world, as well as what needs to happen in the future? How do you see that going forward?
So first of all, what happens around Israel is not controversy, it's theology. The reason that people are obsessed with Israel, for good or for bad, is because Jews play an oversized role in the civilizational foundation of about half of the world's peoples. It's never about any objective facts. The equation of Israel, Zionism, the Star of David with words that connote evil, the laundering of that through international institutions, academia, is all part of the rise of a global, I would say, theological mindset that posits that the world would be a better place without the collective Jew. So this is not controversy. This is like ancient and dangerous ideas. And in many ways, those ideas are correctly, as you noted, in the center of a major battle taking place in the West, and as we discussed in the Arab and Islamic world, about what kind of world do people want to build. Ultimately, societies that have become obsessed with the notion that utopia and salvation lies with the destruction of the Jews have always collapsed and self-destructed. And I think this is the battle that is taking place. Will the more modern, forward-looking identities of the Arab and Islamic world take hold, or the retrograde, the obsessive ones, the conspiracy-minded, the ones that believe that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a real book rather than a forgery? This is happening in the West. This is part of a much larger battle for the soul of those societies. Israel, in that case, is merely a symbol. The good news is, just as there are those who are obsessed with our destructions, there are also those who believe that the world would be a better place with the existence not just of Jews, but sovereign Jews, confident Jews, powerful Jews. And as long as we have those allies, that's what matters.
Einat Wilf, thank you so much for your time. Former politician and also author on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global.
Thank you.